I was happy to point out in Chapter 16, with all of the electrical connections completed and attaching the nacelles to the top of the pylons and the main body of the ship, construction and assembly of the 1/350 scale Polar Lights Enterprise refit kit is complete. This ship is built, and now we move into the process of decaling. So with a little bit of nostalgia and a little bit of sentimentality, I went through the shipyard workspace and put away all the wiring supplies, all the solder and the shrink tubing and lighting and battery connectors and testing and all of that as I make space and move into formally the decorating and registry marking of this ship. I have already done the majority of the Aztec decaling on the saucer. Like I mentioned with the Aztec decaling of the lower saucer, I took the Aztec panels, the long delta-shaped Aztec panels, and actually cut them into two different pieces along this grid line. I did the inner circle, which was about 4 nights work, and now I've been making my way around with the outer circle pieces and really just have 4 panels to go. The panels on the upper saucer, the Aztec decal panels on the upper saucer, are designated as number 2s and number 4s. So when I cut off the bottom portion of each one, I went along the back, then wrote 2 and 4 so that I would know in coming back which one went where. I know that it's possible to lay down an entire long panel. On my first build, I experimented and did one, and it came out okay. But the potential for something going wrong is huge. You only get one shot at it. You only get one of each on this pretty expensive set of decals, and if something went wrong here on the top of the saucer, it would be there for everyone to see. There'd be no way to fix it other than to get another set. Perhaps you could reach out to Polar Lights and order just one sheet, the sheet for the Aztecing for the upper saucer, but that of course would take time. So I decided to use caution and discretion and went ahead and cut each one into 2 pieces. That gives you a little bit more assurance and capability to get everything down. If something started to go wrong with one of those long sheets and you've got an enormous piece of decal to correct, it's sort of weighty in trying to move it around. They are very durable, and they will take a little bit of maneuvering and moving around. But the longer they're in place, the more they start to attach, and the better the chances that along the edges that they will eventually start to rip and tear. So again, for safety's sake, I just went ahead and did the upper ring, and then I'm about finished with the lower ring. There was one panel, this panel here, where I actually had a little bit of trouble, and I'm really glad that I had only done half the panel instead of the full panel. After I'd got it in place and I was carefully dabbing all the water out and all the air bubbles out with a paper towel, I did a sideways motion with the paper towel, and actually, even though it seemed like it was firmly in place, the entire panel slid sideways and crumpled and wadded up. So I took a paintbrush and applied generous portions of water to keep it very damp, and with toothpicks and my fingers very, very carefully flattened everything out. I was fortunate that the decal itself, even though it crumpled and wadded up, did not fold over in on itself. It's been my experience that if these things fold over, then it's almost impossible to get to get them to straighten back out. They're very adhesive on the underside, and once those two adhesive pieces come together, it's really hard to get them separated. So I had a little bit of good fortune in the misfortune that it didn't fold over, and by careful application, continued application of the setting solution in the water to keep it good and damp, I was able to straighten it back out and move it back around in place. That's the only mishap I've had with the Aztecing. And so now, like I said, it'll take about 20 minutes or so to apply these last 4 panels, and I'll let them fully set. The next move is going to go through. There are a handful of little teeny bubbles that you can see as everything is dried. I'm going to go back, very carefully pierce each one, and then give everything a good coating of microsol. Then after that's dried, I'm going to give everything another coating of Tamiya semi-gloss, and that's going to make a really good surface for the registry marking decals to go on. I've done a little bit of Aztecing in other portions of the ship. I've done some of the nacelles. I've also done some of the deflector housing. And you know, I was thinking that I would just go through and do all the Aztecing first, then go back and do the registry markings. But at this point, I'm really a little impatient, and I want to see that this is the NCC 1701 USS Enterprise, and so probably after that final coat has cured, I am going to go back and apply the registry markings. Like I said at the end of chapter 16, not a big fan of the Enterprise A thing, and I'm going to be going with the Enterprise. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is, my love for Star Trek, my love for this ship, and my feelings on the whole Enterprise A thing. But we'll get to that a little bit later in the chapter. For right now, I'm going to finish Aztecing the decal, move on to other portions of the Aztecing and registry marking for this build. It's been about 2.5 weeks since I shot my last sequence. At that time, I had laid down the inner ring of Aztec decal paneling and had started on the outer ring portions and explained that process why I was doing it that way. And at the time, I said that I was really impatient to see some of the registry markings, see those beautiful words NCC 1701. And Enterprise here and the decal forward here, and I was just going to go ahead and knock those out just so that I can see them. I ended up sticking to the Aztec process and worked my way all the way back through, and have now done all of the sheets of Aztec paneling for this build. When I finished the upper saucer, went down and did the deflector dish array and housing, the lower dorsal neck, because I'd already done the upper portions of the dorsal neck, back on both sides of the secondary hull, laying down the strong back decal, Aztec decal paneling. And I went with the blue just like I did on my first build because I really like this shade of blue, and I think it gives a beautiful look to this kit. Then the nacelle pylons on both sides. And then the nacelles themselves, as the instruction sheet indicated, working from the front to the back. There are 2 really small portions where a very small corner of the Aztec decal sheet folded over. There's one on the starboard nacelle and one on the outside of the port nacelle. Just a tiny little portion where the decal sheet folded over, a little corner, and I wasn't able to smooth it out. Fortunately, I'll be able to go in with a hobby knife and surgically shear those away, and they're so small, and with the white backing, no one will be able to tell that there should be a little bit of Aztec paneling there. It's just really it'll look like a little teeny square, sort of like this. There are 1 or 2 problems with the numbering of the Aztec decals in the numbering in the instruction sheet where they're supposed to go. So in going through the Aztec decaling panels and instruction sheet, I discovered a few places where the numbering was off, where the numbering was actually reversed, such as for the secondary hull side panels. panel number 36 and panel number 37. The numbering is actually reversed backwards on these. For the starboard side, this forward panel that has the little notch corner that goes right here should be 36. It's labeled as 37. And this panel here that's 37 that also goes forward, has a little notch panel, should be 36. It's interesting to note that also that they show that 36 or 37, they show it as 37 again. They have a little directional line that says that you should drop it in right here in the same space that number 39 goes. So they need to really clean this up just a bit. I did a little bit of online Googling and discovered that there are some other Aztec decal sheets that Polar Lights has put out with numbering problems on their panels. What I recommend, of course, to overcome this is before you put any panel down, dry fit them, make sure that they are absolutely going to go into that space. Also here on the rear portion of the nacelles, panel number 82 and panel number 83, once again the numbering is reversed. For the port side, it should be part 83, not 82. On the starboard side, it should be part 82, not 83. Again, don't take my word for it. When you've cut these panels out, dry fit them to make sure that the orientation is correct and that they are going to lay down as they're supposed to. A few other interesting things about the Aztec decaling. And I'd love to hear in the comments, some folks, for the pylons, these long sort of delta-shaped blue panels, it is extremely tricky getting these grid lines right here to line up in the indented molded spaces where they are on the interior of the pylon. At first it looks like they're just not going to fit, and it takes some real careful moving and maneuvering around and constantly brushing down this decal with water to keep it pliable, because they will eventually start to dry out and they will rip if you're not careful. For me, it took some real maneuvering around to get that panel into place in these grid lines over the indented portions, but I finally got it done. And then another interesting thing, and once again, please feel free to include in the comments if you've discovered this when you were doing the Aztec decaling on your 350 refit, because I discovered this on the first time I built this kit, that for the saucer section size, the sensor bands, what they call saucer section size, which are actually the sensor bands, they say that it takes 8. They provide you with 8 of these sensor bands that go around, and what I discovered is that 7 of them actually fills that space, and I actually had to do a little bit of trimming here and a little bit of trimming here when I made my way completely around. So I ended up with one of those sensor bands left over. I cut a little notch out here when I did some patchwork on a portion, but please, if you've experienced this when doing your Aztec decaling, if you've experienced there is one sensor band decal too many, please include that in the comments. So after I finished all of the Aztec decaling, then I went back with my hobby knife and very carefully pricked just a few air bubbles that were mostly around the saucer. I had 1 or 2 on the nacelles, didn't have any on the secondary hull. Pricked them open, tamped them down a little bit, then went through painted everything with microsol, about 2 coats, which really help firmly seal the Aztec decals onto the hull, and it really looks fantastic. This really has the effect now of looking like plating. So my next step is going to be going in and masking the officer's lounge, the impulse crystal, the front of the deflector crystal, and both of the arboretum windows. Mask those, put this entire kit in the paint box, give everything two dustings, two light dustings of the Tamiya semi-gloss so that it will be ready and I can start laying down the registry decals. There are a lot. I am going to start, because I really do want to see them, like I said, with the Enterprise registries. And before I begin that process, I'm going to talk a little bit, as I indicated, about my love of the Starship Enterprise, why I really wanted to build not just one but two of these kits, and why I'm going with the strict Enterprise and not the Enterprise A. So what's really behind my beef with the whole Enterprise A thing, and why I'm so determined that this ship, just like my first build, is going to be the Enterprise? Well, strap yourself in, because this is something of a history lesson, maybe a little more or a lot more than you want to know. But really, to explain that, we have to go way back. As if the gray hair doesn't illustrate, I'm old enough that I watched Star Trek and its initial run in the late 60s on television. But going back a few years before that, I was about 7 years old when Lost in Space premiered. As I said, way back in the first chapter of this build series, I was in love with the hardware of that show. The Jupiter 2, the Chariot, the robot, and also, of course, that the protagonist, Will Robinson, was close to my age. Now, fast forward a few years, and I was beginning to burn out and get really tired of the constant buffoonery of Dr. Smith, and how most of the plots of most of the episodes really was the same story on repeat. They would somehow get the ship functioning. They knew they needed to get to Alpha Centauri. Dr. Smith, either because of some get-rich-quick scheme or trying to get back to Earth, or some combination of both of those themes, would bungle things for everybody, and by the end of the episode they were right back where they started. Devotees of Lost in Space may have noted for many episodes they weren't really lost. They knew where they were, and they knew they needed to get to Alpha Centauri. But again, Dr. Smith bungled things. Now, I had no idea that a show called Star Trek had premiered. I probably did not see any of the first or maybe even half of the second season, and really didn't even know that it was on the air. But we went to dinner, myself, my parents, my brother, my sister, with family, friends, sitting around in the den after dinner. A show called Star Trek came on, and I was immediately dialed in. One of the first things that struck me was how fully functioning this ship was. The corridors were filled with people who had assigned roles. There seemed to be hundreds of people that it took to make this ship fly. Also, the themes, the things they were talking about, there were no children on this show. They were very adult. I didn't quite understand what they were talking about, but I appreciated the fact that it was really geared towards adults. Also, as I came to see in future episodes and watching the show, they very rarely mentioned Earth. It was not an Earth-centric show. It was about space exploration. But what really sucked me in was the Enterprise itself. I was fascinated by the design of this ship. It's my understanding that Gene Roddenberry, in the design phase of the show, had instructed Matt Jeffries to design something that was like no one had ever seen in spaceship design. And Matt Jeffries definitely knocked that one out of the park. I think the term iconic is vastly overused in marketing and television and PR, but in this case, iconic is the best description. That is an iconic design. It is unforgettable. Everybody knows what the Enterprise is and identifies Star Trek because of the design of the USS Enterprise. As I watched the show, whenever I had the opportunity, whenever I could beg my parents to let me stay up late enough to see it, I kept looking at the ship, and I was fascinated by the ship the few seconds we saw in each episode, and tried to figure out why it was designed that way. And I came to conclude that this was a ship that was not intended to fly through an atmosphere. This was a ship that would never land on a planet. And then, after thinking about that, really came to a conclusion that was somewhat mind-bending for me, is if it wasn't intended to land on a planet, then maybe it was not built on a planet, that it was built in space. That concept blew my mind and set me off on a course of reading a lot of science fiction, the hardcore nuts and bolts science fiction of Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and others. Now, 1968, 10 years old, and I go to see 2001: A Space Odyssey. The Blue Danube theme of 2001, where we see the large space station in orbit turning. Portions of it were incomplete, they were building it, really further fueled my love for nuts and bolts, hardcore science fiction, building things in space. I wanted to see more science fiction like that. And what had to wait quite a few years before we got the dry dock sequence in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Big beautiful spaceship being constructed in space with gorgeous music and not a lot of chitty chat, not a lot of talking. Let's look at this big beautiful ship. And I did indeed fall in love with this design. For the redesign of the Enterprise, of Matt Jeffries' Enterprise, Richard Taylor and Andy Probert and others really scored and designed a beautiful, beautiful starship. I'm in love with their redesign of the Enterprise for Star Trek the Motion Picture. So let's go forward to some of the other films and how we got to the whole Enterprise A thing. Going into the second film, Wrath of Khan, Leonard Nimoy really said that he did not want to play the character anymore and asked that Spock be killed off at the end of the movie. Paramount, of course, did not want to say goodbye and to sunset a really popular character, but they also wanted to try to give him what he wanted and coax him back before the cameras. So they came up with something that was a lot like George Lucas did in The Empire Strikes Back, when Harrison Ford didn't want to play Han Solo anymore, wanted that character killed. At the end of the movie, we get the whole carbonite thing, which is, we'll kill you but not kill you, and we'll leave a backdoor plan so that we could bring you back if needed, which is what they did with Spock, what they did with the whole Genesis planet story. They killed him at the end of the movie, but there was a way that maybe he's not quite dead, maybe we can bring him back, which brings us to Star Trek III. Paramount had really started to scale back the budget of these films, and they were really under budgeted for what they needed to be for their scope and their scale, for the special effects, for casting all those extras to be all those crew members roaming the halls of the Enterprise. So, and of course, with the skyrocketing salaries of the principal actors, cuts had to be made. And for Star Trek III, we get a story where just a handful of crew members steal the Enterprise, and so we don't get a fully staffed, fully functioning Star Trek Enterprise. We don't get those wonderful shots of all those crew members roaming the halls as they go off to the Genesis planet. 2 films in a row, we're still talking about this Genesis project, to try to bring Spock back. And what do we get? Well, at the end of Wrath of Khan, we killed the major character. At the end of Search for Spock, we'll one-up that and we'll destroy the Enterprise. Now, I don't really have a lot of heartburn with destroying the Enterprise. It's just the way it was so poorly rendered. Instead of something grand and important, such as the Enterprise maybe rushing into a solar system whose planet is about to go supernova on some rescue mission, and maybe confronting a fleet of Klingon ships or enemy ships and going down in battle, we get a handful of Klingons on a smaller ship because, again, budget, who come on board, and Kirk sets the auto-destruct sequence, because of a handful of Klingons. It was really a cheap and, for me, undeserving fate for the Enterprise. Of course, the effect sequence looked fantastic, I'll give them that, but it was really a lot less important of a reason to destroy this ship. So Star Trek IV, we don't even get an Enterprise. Most of the movie is shot on the Bird of Prey, this, once again, handful of crew members operating the Bird of Prey, a Klingon ship. And then at the very, very end of the movie, we bring in the Enterprise reconstructed, slapped with the label Enterprise A. And this would be the ship going forward through the next few films. So for me, the Enterprise A really illustrates and symbolizes and stands for the way Paramount undercut the promise of its flagship franchise, undercut the importance and the iconography of this ship, and destroyed it really for budgetary constraints in the cheapest possible way. Probably a lot of people will disagree with me on this. Probably a lot of builders will push back. I appreciate the fact that Polar Lights gives you the option to classify this ship in different ways, give it different names, and yes, if you would like, call it the Enterprise A. For me, it's the Enterprise as we see it in Star Trek the Motion Picture, as we see it in the dry dock sequence, as we see it when it pulls away from Earth orbit. That's the ship I love. That's the ship that I want to build. Now, having said far more than most people probably want to hear about my love of the Enterprise and why I am going with the Enterprise, not the Enterprise A, let's make our way one more time down through those crowded corridors of the Starship Enterprise to the wreck deck for one more mail call. At the beginning of this build, I had put on back order this decal set from HDA, this backup set, a replacement set of aftermarket pinstriping. It's been on back order throughout this entire build, and lo and behold, really perfect timing. Timing is everything. They became available as I started the registry decaling process of the build, now that I've finished the Aztec decaling. So we have a lot of the decaling that will go around the upper saucer, the little multicolored emergency hatches, the little red rings that will go around a lot of the lights, and a lot of these little boxes that go around the phaser banks and the RCS thrusters and things. And then the pinstriping that goes around the upper bridge dome. Now, I am going to attempt to use the stock Polar Lights pinstriping for that upper bridge dome. What I did was, just like the little red box that goes under the fantail of the secondary hull, I gave this about 2 dustings of Tamiya semi-gloss to give them a little bit of support. That worked great for that box. You have to be really careful if you apply too many coats of a sealer on these, and the decals won't release from the backing paper. So I'm going to attempt to use the stock decals as opposed to the aftermarket HDA Model Works pinstriping decals, but if these come apart, then I know that I've got a backup. One of the things that I love about HDA, when they send you decals, they give you extra sets. So they also sent these really cool little stickers here. How cool is that, right? I will, when it comes time to lay down the actual naming portions, I am going to use the JT Graphics registry markings. for the actual name of the ship and the Federation designation. I've used these in a few places, like the word Enterprise that's on the underside of the saucer. I'm very happy with the look of these decals, the durability, how easy they are to place. So my next step is going to be classifying this ship as the NCC 1701 USS Enterprise. So with the registry and titling decaling finished, this ship is officially christened the USS Enterprise NCC 1701, as close as I could get it to how we saw it at the beginning in the dry dock sequence of Star Trek The Motion Picture and then throughout the remainder of that film. I am very pleased with the way it came out. The majority of the titling, decaling, I utilized the JT Graphics decals. I'm very happy with these decals. They held together very well. They transferred very well off the backing paper, laid down well. There was very little silvering once they had dried, and then I went back and gave them a fine coat with a model paintbrush of microsol, and when it dried, then all of that silvering was gone, and these titles now look like they were officially painted onto the hull. I have also done the registry pennant that runs down each side of the secondary hull, and have done the title that the registry title that runs across its little butt, just above the shuttle bay. I've also done the NCC 1701 United Federation of Planets titling that goes on the back of the nacelles. Make sure and pay attention to the justification of the registries, the NCC 1701 United Federation of Planets, on the rear of the nacelles. So on the port side, the justification is the N will line up straight over the U. In other words, they are justified to the left, and that is true of your port and your starboard nacelles, but this is the port view. On the starboard, they are justified differently, where the 1 is going where the NCC 1701 is actually indented, and the 1 is right over the S, and that will be uniform when you're looking from the starboard side and you're looking at the outside and the inside. I noticed this the first time I built this kit, and I posted something to a Facebook build group. Someone chimed in and detailed how this is actual maritime law in terms of registering ships, and explain what the tradition was in that. It was pretty fascinating. Also of note, if you go with the NCC 1701A decaling, then you don't have to worry about this, because the NCC 1701A is actually center blocked over the United Federation of Planet on all 4 of these decals. And as I said earlier in the chapter, when as much as possible, I wanted to use the stock decal red pinstriping for these boxes here around the phaser banks, as well as around the RCS thrusters, and then the pinstriping on the bridge dome. And as I said, I took some precaution, and the specific portion of the decals with these pinstripings, I'd clipped them out, gave them 2 fine dustings of Tamiya semi-gloss, and let that sealer dry, and then really happy to say that they transferred off of the backing paper very well onto the bulge of the bridge dome. There are, as I remember, 3 pieces each for the top and 3 pieces for the bottom. You have a semicircle around here, 1 piece that wraps around this way, 1 piece that wraps around this way, and they have to be stitched together. About 3 of the 6 pieces actually cracked in one place each as they went down, and of course I laid them all down separately. But that's nothing compared to some of the other pinstriping decaling, stock pinstriping decaling that just broke into multiple pieces and drift all over the place and were just completely unusable. I will say, even with them going down as a continuous piece and holding together as best as possible, it's still a very tricky procedure to get them very straight and as parallel as possible with this line here, and then getting them to wrap around the back portion of the dome just above and just below the windows for the officers lounge, making sure they are as straight and as even as possible. But it is a great detail and really adds to the look of the ship. And so now let's fire up the lights and see how she will look in deep space. Again, I'm so happy that all of the lighting systems are working as they should. The strobe lights, the navigation lights, and then Ralph Tanaglia's controls circuitry board, which controls the warp sequence. I'm afraid from this angle you can't see the deflector dish crystal as it ramps up in amber and then becomes blue. But then from there, the impulse engines cut on. Let me dim the lights fully. So we can see how cool that impulse crystal looks. And then of course also from this angle, you can't see inside the grills of the engines themselves, the impulse engines themselves, but they look really fantastic. And then the chiller grills come on, signifying that we are in warp drive. After a good spin, a good test drive in warp drive, we come back down to impulse power. Another thing I'm really pleased with is the practical effect of this flood of the saucer, this floodlight on the saucer, lighting up the registry markings. The LEDs that the SMD LEDs that I have here in the bridge dome, I think do a really great job giving a practical lighting effect on that bridge dome. So this is where I'm going to wrap up Chapter 17 of Walker Street Shipyards. There is still some decaling left to do, even with the titling decals in place. There are several dozen, maybe up to 50 or 60 more little red dots, little black dots, a few little squiggles and things. The vast majority of those are going to go all over the nacelles, but there's a few that go along the secondary hull. There's a few that go down the back of the impulse engine array. So probably about another week's solid work to get all of those final little dots and things in place. But this ship is very close to being space worthy. Chapter 18 will be the official launch chapter of this build. So please join me in the next chapter and we will launch this big, beautiful USS Enterprise.